Jack.
Levi.
The Book Club from Hell.
So today on the podcast, I'm really, really happy to have... I'm sorry about your name. You offered me 3 different options of pronunciation, but Udith, or something. I think I said that in a more Slavic-sounding way, but that's how it sounded to me. Dematagoda, of many different projects. So I came across you first based on your novel Agonist, published in 2024, but you've done a remarkable number of other things. You've got a novel out, Horizontal Rain, another book, Vladimir Nabokov and the Ideological Aesthetic. Are you currently editing or have finished editing Left Wings Over Europe by Wyndham Lewis?
That was published last month, yeah. I finished it in that.
Congratulations.
I tried to kind of
publish.
Cheers. Yeah, this is one of these kind of labors of love, as they say euphemistically. Just all academic books, basically.
Yeah, but you've also you've got your Substack, Imminent Dissolution, which is also really great. I found a number of it sounded like post-punk bands to me that you're on guitar and doing vocals in. Sorry if I got the precise genre wrong. I'm
no, that's exactly it.
Post-punk's a bit sophisticated for me.
No, that's exactly the genre, I would say.
Yeah, you are also an academic. I found modernist literature scholar and literary theorist. You're an editor and publisher at Hyperidean Press. Has some really, really pretty editions, including Agonist. I am picking up on an undercurrent of admiration for Wyndham Lewis, or at least an appreciation of his work. So there are a few of those are his paintings on the covers.
Well, there's one.
Oh, just one.
Just for Agonist, yeah.
Okay.
The other stuff is mostly original artwork, so we usually try to get like a contemporary artist, or in the case of Augustine's novel, it was one of his own paintings because he's a painter. But yeah, we usually try to get like contemporary artists or photographers for the covers, but I really wanted that Wyndham Lewis painting because it had some kind of personal resonance. Well, some kind of like relevance for the book itself, I guess. And yeah, Lewis has been quite influential on my work.
Are there any other projects of yours that I missed that you think would be good for people to hear about? Because for listeners, there's a lot.
Yeah, I mean, like I don't see that much continuity between my academic work, even my criticism, and my kind of like fiction stuff. Like I tried for a while to just like have them under separate names, but the way it's kind of aggregated like online through just ISBNs and stuff, it seems to just like group them together. So I tried like very like consciously to have my like full name for my academic books and then my initials for my fiction, but it didn't seem to have worked because there's not that many people, I guess. But I guess it's all connected, I guess. But yeah, I think that's pretty much it. To be honest, yeah. I had a kind of formal life as a musician, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, like I mentioned though, I first became aware of you because I came across, I forget whose review of Agonist it was, but I came across a review of Agonist on Substack, and it sounded interesting, so I got a copy on a whim, and it's a truly bizarre book. I'm normally a bit leery of reading experimental fiction or experimental novels because oftentimes either the experiment doesn't work, or it's more an excuse to write in very, very flowery first person present tense prose for 200 pages and lead nowhere. But Agonist is truly interesting and feels fresh. Could you talk about the process of writing Agonist? Because it really feels like a distillation of a number of internet forums. At least the first half, it blasted into your mind. It's really strange.
So I mean, I guess I begin with the idea, the notion that I just hate the internet.
Yeah.
Like, I hate everything about it. I hate the kind of like the influence it's had on every aspect of my sort of like involuntary influence it has on the way that you kind of conduct yourself and the way that your thought is kind of textured, etc. Right? And when I kind of first conceived of the idea, it was almost a kind of like idea to sort of trying to exorcise, I guess, try to expunge the influence of the internet from my sort of creative consciousness, I guess, right? And then I came to it really by mistake to a very large extent, because I was working on various things and I had a lot of kind of ideas, but like many people, I'm unable to sort of focus because of the influence of the internet and because of the kind of like the attention deficit it kind of inculcates, I guess, right? So I had a lot of things to do, and I was living in Japan at the time, and for various kind of personal reasons, there was kind of a lot of pressure, a lot of kind of like things going on at the time. And I was just extremely like pissed off by how much time I just wasted looking at all this like extremely annoying text by just random people on the internet. Because I was never somebody that tweeted per se. I never actually like had an account where I tweeted regularly. But I always like, it was back then when you could actually view tweets without having to sign up for the account, etc. And somebody else would post them, and then I'd just go down this rabbit hole, just seeing like this sort of, pensée minuit of like morons in the fucking internet. it's like fucking morons, right? And like not just like a specific type of moron, just morons of every description, I guess, right? And there's just this kind of like moronic inferno. I guess, and and it was a particular type of person, like it's a particular kind of like texture thought. It's this kind of like an extension of a kind of internet collective humor, which I always found kind of abhorrent and stupid. Like anything, I think that things that are kind of like agreed upon by consensus to be sort of profound or funny or whatever are always suspect in my view, right? So like there's things like that, and then also other things like just things on forums or like that you see elsewhere, turns of phrase, journalistic cliches. Like, I mean, there's this idea that I kind of grasp, that everybody kind of grasps, that the internet is just this like ridiculous, like annoying palimpsest of like just stupidity and just everything, right? It's like collectively kind of offered, etc. Right? So what I did, and I didn't really think about it at the time, this is me kind of like retrospectively thinking about it, is that like I was going on a walk around the university campus of Waseda University, where I was working at the time, and there was a stationery shop, and then I went in, and it was a brand of notebook called Nemosin, and I mean the Japanese are very fond of using like random sort of anglicisms or like random sort of words, etc. But like Namelson meant a lot to me because it was the name, the original working title for Vladimir Nabokov's autobiography was Speak Nemosin, which eventually became Speak Memory. And then I did my PhD on Vladimir Nabokov, and I spent a lot of time with his kind of texts and his letters and his archives, etc. And then so I bought this notebook, and I didn't really know what to do with it. I always have like notebooks that I don't use, but this one I thought I kind of wanted to use somehow. So what I did is that I used it as a kind of trick. Whenever I saw something stupid on the internet that annoyed me, I kind of wrote it down in this notebook. And then it gave me a sense of being kind of productive on the internet. And whenever I had like a kind of response, like a tweet-like thought or something, or I saw like a stupid tweet or something that was like interesting, because it has a kind of interesting aesthetic quality to all this stupid stuff on the internet, right? It has a kind of quality of like half-formed poetry that has its own kind of like, in a manner of speaking, like sublimity to, I guess, sublimeness to, I guess, right? So I mean, what I did is I accumulated all of this stuff, all of these kind of like, I filled that entire notebook up in like a year or something, right? And then eventually at some point I just started kind of channeling that kind of like texture into something. And then the line between what I saw on the internet and what I actually wrote in that particular kind of like act of ventriloquism, I guess, was like completely blurred. And that was the whole premise of Agonist, which I just kind of organized into a sort of text. And there's a kind of like underlying narrative to it, which I don't really want to get into because I think that's part of the sort of the joy of reading, to try and fathom sort of mystery behind it, I guess. So that's basically how I came to write it.
Yeah, and for listeners who are thinking about picking up this book, it is, like you said, there is actually a structure to it, and it's not just transcribed tweets, although it initially feels that way, but it does reveal something more structured and something much more interesting. It's at least how I found it, was a really interesting meditation on communication and this very, very strange style of asymmetrical communication that's come about on the internet, but particularly on internet forums, and especially algorithmically driven ones like Twitter, where you're blasted with this screeching id of the collective stupid person, or maybe 5 or 6 collective stupid people. But also because they've got people who are paid a great deal of money to maximize for user engagement, it's very hard to pull away from it as well. You find yourself involuntarily forced to continue looking through it, despite the fact that you can feel it probably harming you on some level. But one thing that Agonist does really, really well is it gives the impression of when you're scrolling through something like a Twitter feed, or if you're on Reddit or wherever, any one of these places, that strange sensation I get of only communicating with a small number of aggregates of people. You're communicating with kind of not with thousands of individual human beings, but with Reddit man. Or if you're on Twitter, you're not communicating with individuals, but you're communicating with right-wing Twitter man or aggressively progressive Twitter woman, or whatever it may be. I'm sure Blue Sky has its own menagerie of human accumulations. And through the sorting of these missives from the internet into different sections in Agonist, really does that. Were you getting that impression too, that you weren't communicating with individuals anymore, but with these odd accumulations, or is that something that just emerged
No,
from
that's exactly
observing
what
this
I.
closely enough?
No, I think that you kind of hit the nail on the head to some extent. It really doesn't feel like you're communicating with anybody. You're communicating with some kind of elements of a kind of like archetypal collective unconscious, but a very diabolical element of it, right? That's the whole
Yeah,
kind of,
yeah.
and that kind of underlies Agonist, I guess, right? So like but the other point I wanted to say, like with regards to the earlier point, was that I had to change everything, right? So there's not one line. There may be a couple of lines that are completely unchanged, but like
There are a few that I felt embarrassed for actually recognizing.
you're right, yeah. So like those are kind of like seminal, I guess, like part of the lore, I guess. But the other ones I really had to like just change, otherwise it would be too easy to kind of trace the source material, I guess. But the thing is that like a lot of these things appear and then they'll be deleted and then they'll disappear. You know what I mean? So like it really is like there's nobody. There is just an act of kind of collective authorship to some extent, right? I mean, and all of the kind of like negative aspects and negative kind of feeling that comes from something that's collectively authored, I'm attempting to communicate. But yeah, you're right that you're not really communicating with an individual because the levels of sort of mediation that exist between an individual consciousness and whatever is expressed on the internet is so removed, right? People log in and they log into their kind of like anonymous, I don't know, Twitter account or whatever, and then they start posting as someone that's completely like several removes away from who they actually are, right? And then, yeah.
It's that,
Just,
I mean, several
I don't
moves
understand
away,
it.
or it's hard to say because
Or is it really what they're actually like? I don't know. Mostly, I'm not sure, but I mean, whatever it is, it's deeply unpleasant.
there's something. It feels slightly Titanic about it in that it's I don't know, this collective screaming, mewling id that as soon as you interact with it begins to condition you as well. I don't think I've come out of it without some some form of conditioning of my own unconscious by interacting with whatever is taking shape online. It's hard to say if it's expressing something that's already there, or if it's assembling human consciousnesses and conditioning them into something else. Whatever
Something else
it feels threatening.
It feels truly diabolical. Let's not be around the bush here, right? Remember when that whole AI image thing in its first like kind of iteration came out, DALL-E or whatever it is?
Yeah.
Do you remember how horribly diabolical and actually frightening those images are? How
The faces
utterly
and
inhuman
hands,
they were.
particularly.
They were so. They really looked like they were coming from the depths of hell. They really were a kind of perfect encapsulation of how diabolical the internet is, I thought. Diabolical in all senses of the word.
It's talking about it as diabolical is like there are a few things there. One, it's interesting that, at least to my mind, the most human parts of the human body, the face and the hands, were the parts that were most mangled by
Exactly.
Dawley and by
Yeah.
those early I think it's a diffusion model. Also, then talking about that internet id as diabolical is interesting too, because it does exhibit some of the aspects of demonic possession, at least in the users, in that users and I count myself among them, you begin to be compelled to do things that in no way you would do normally. Like, does a normal person drift from messaging someone to, if you scroll enough on the newsfeed, watching people get into fights or get run over or combat footage? But you're compelled to by some strange force. So viewing it as diabolical is probably actually quite useful. It gives a sense of the possession that takes place. Do you think this form of communication and existence truly new? Is this something that really came about with the internet? Or has it always been present, just much slower? Especially with mass media and those sort of things. Or is it like...
Well, I mean, like, I did a lot of research into, like, the sort of origins and influence of technology, right? And then into my, mostly kind of in my academic book that I've been spending a long time writing and hasn't been published yet. So, I mean, there is a kind of argument that many people make, not many people, but some people make, like philosophers of science, etc., that the notion of the internet is something that has existed in some form without the actual architecture and the actual technology that we have to support it, right? I mean, it's something that you could argue that the notion of conception of Jorge Luis Borges, the Library of Babel or something like that, is this notion of the internet, etc. Yes, okay. I guess I could accept it on some level. However, I have a friend who works with like computer-human interaction. Like he's a computer scientist. He's also like an electronic musician. But he is got this very kind of distinct Luddite streak to him. I'm very much a kind of neo-Luddite as well, even though I'm on the internet far too much. Perhaps not in practice quite yet. But he explained to me something that's very simple, but once you kind of understand it, it allows things to make a lot more sense, I guess. Like every kind of interface on social media and smartphones, etc., is designed to make you addicted, right?
Yeah.
Like everything about it is designed to make you addicted. So, I mean, it's nothing to do with the ability to communicate, which back in the heady days of like 2010, etc., people thought it was going to lead to like an imminent sort of like utopian situation or something, right? It was only the means of communication. If we could all communicate with each other across the world and have a common language, then obviously the next step is a sort of peaceful utopia and perpetual peace, etc., right? But that doesn't account for the way in which such communications tools came about in the first place, right? The internet was designed by the military, by nuclear scientists, etc., right? That wanted to communicate between, I think, the DARPA and the CERN project, etc. These are the kind of forerunners of the internet. Like many things, they had a kind of military purpose to it. But it also, after it stops having a military purpose, it starts having the other purpose, which is kind of imposed upon it, which is the market logic, okay? So how are you going to make something that enough people are going to use that you could kind of, therefore, skim off profits on and make it kind of worthwhile for the capitalist class, etc.? You're going to have to make people addicted. And as many people as possible. And then you're going to you have all the kind of like data and information which you could sell as to advertisers, etc., etc. So, I mean, the tools, if they were completely self-regulating and not run for profit, would have led to some sort of utopian situation. It wouldn't be the same internet. Obviously, it wouldn't be, because it wouldn't have the purpose on the very fundamental engineering level of making you addicted, of making you engage only on the level of making you fight with people and argue with people and hate people, etc. I mean, that's all engagement to them, isn't it? I guess. But yeah, I'm not sure. It's difficult.
That aspect of compelled communication then makes it seem particularly diabolical. That's you're locked in a room and prodded to make you fight with other people. Really, I guess anything that has high limbic drive.
Yeah, I mean, it really just appeals to like a very fundamental need for being, right? Which is recognition, I guess, which all humans have, unless you have some sort of kind of psychopathological kind of defense against it, I guess. Right? But like, if you provide people with the means to have some level of kind of recognition on demand, then they're going to use it, I guess, right? Something that provides some kind of justification for their being, their existence, then it's going to have an appeal. But it's a sham existence, right? It's not. It's a sham recognition. It's not real.
Yeah, well, like we were saying earlier, it's this strange means of communication between you as an individual with an accumulation of thousands and thousands and thousands of other users. So I mean, insofar as you can be recognized by something that's spectral. It is actually, you bringing up recognition is interesting in light of, you wrote some really nice pieces on your Substack about the internet guy and the e-girl particularly is this tragic consolational parasocial relationship. Would you mind explaining what the internet guy and the e-girl are, at least in your reading of them? Because it was a really, really nice pair of essays you wrote on those.
Yeah, I mean, I'll probably like preface that by saying that like I don't really see myself as like so essayist or like a critic or whatever. Like again, I tried to keep this kind of separation between like I always approach the world very much kind of like artistically, and I think whatever else you do is a kind of day job. Like, and I always thought, what kind of job could I do that I wouldn't feel completely miserable with and possibly make some money? I'm also incredibly impractical, and I decided on being an academic, I guess, and that's not really worked out in an ideal way, because it is a job like any other, and a very precarious and very difficult job to sort of do. But yeah, I mean, I like writing essays and stuff. And the very kind of like, I like the essayistic form, right? You know, the essayistic form is not something that tries to make definitive like conclusions about things. Tries to attempt to give an explanation of it. And like, I'm not like a scholar of the internet. Like, I fucking hate the internet. Right? It's like, why would I want to be a scholar of something I despise? But I just like observing phenomena and trying to relate it to some things that seem quite familiar to me, seem quite perennial to me. The internet guy, yeah, I think I got, if I recall, I mean, like, I don't really reread the pieces I write. If I recall, I think I watched some of these like online politics is that the right term? Like debating guys.
I actually try pretty hard not to be very online, so I'm peripherally aware of.
So I think it's
the debate guys
like
online.
Really, really like ridiculously annoying. I think it's called like Destiny or something.
Yeah. There was
Yeah, he's
sex tape
he's
of
like
his
one.
came out, which my friends decided it was imperative to spam me with videos of. So that's actually the most
Yeah.
Destiny content I have consumed is a video of him getting his willy sucked.
So I mean, the guy's shtick, I guess, is like just being extremely annoying, and that's his kind of engagement farming thing. Like, I don't think he even tries, but he's just like an extremely annoying person, I guess, right? And that's his kind of like that's his thing, I guess, right? Like everything about like his obviously his opinions, but like his voice and his kind of like mannerisms, etc. Very irritating person. So I mean, I saw him debate like Norman Finkelstein or something like that, and then somebody sent me something about there's another guy that was I guess he's like a communist or like a Stalinist or something. I can't remember what his name is. And then there's another guy who's like a Marxist and something. And they're all like kind of like podgy, bearded sort of gamer types, I guess, right? Like, and I guess what I related it to, as far as I recall, was there's an Austrian philosopher called Robert Fowler, who's an acolyte of Slavoj Žižek. I met Robert Fowler a couple of times. He wrote a really interesting book called Interpassivity. And there's this idea that, have you heard of that before?
Is that where it came from? Because I've come across that term in Jameson and Fisher.
Interpassivity. I'm pretty sure in the 90s or in the late 90s or something, Fowler was the one that kind of like really fleshed it out. It might come from from earlier, maybe it was kind of like mentioned, or maybe those concepts are quite different. But Fowler's notion of interpassivity relates to this idea of people, when you observe people doing things, you kind of feel the sensations or emotions or whatever, the satisfactions they have on behalf of them. So you don't have to do it yourself. One of the examples he uses, and which I've come across several times, is that people that used to be alcoholics really like getting other people to drink, even though they don't drink themselves. And they like watching people enjoy having a drink. And that allows them, and I had an experience of that with, like, you know, within my extended family, etc. Right? I saw somebody who was an alcoholic who stopped drinking, and then he would always be like, "Do you want to have a beer? You should have a beer. You look like you want to have a beer." And then when I would drink the beer, they would have this kind of like enjoyment on my behalf, right?
It's like people watching videos of people practicing guitar on YouTube.
Yes, exactly. Or doing anything.
Doing your scales yourself.
Yeah. So, I mean, Fowler wrote that very specifically. He's like an art historian, largely. I think he's a professor, like an art school or something. And he wrote about relational aesthetics, Nicolas Bouillot, and all this, these kind of like 90s art theorists, etc. And this idea of participation, questioning what that is, etc. Right? It's this kind of idea. But I just took this notion of Fowler's interpassivity, and also it's not 100% that what it is. I think this equally persuasive and quite popular at the moment is this kind of notion of mimetic desire by René Girard, etc. Right? So I mean, I just kind of the truth from my perspective lies somewhere in between those two things, I think. And then I think that's generally what this idea of the internet guy and the e-girl, but both of those are kind of masculine reactions. One of them is a reaction to a certain trope, but both of them are concerned with masculinity, I think, right? Because I think that they're both projections. On the case of the internet guy, I don't think that they're figures of admiration, these people. Clearly not in the case of this Destiny guy, right? Absolutely not. So, but what they are is they affirm, and the viewer is able to recognize and vicariously experience a certain form of affirmation for all of their negative qualities, being just the kind of like slovenly, annoying, internet addicted moron. Which is it's very unkind, but I guess that what I mean is, I'm not saying that all those the fans of those guys are the same, but like they recognize their own failures and shortcomings and not merely their aspirations in these people. The internet guy, I guess, right? And it was a very short piece. It actually blew up a lot more than I thought it would be. I just fired it off, really, but I guess there was something that resonated with people in it. The internet, and I thought I would kind of follow that up with something else, like people in. I don't really like giving people what they want. I never have. But I'm interested to some extent, I guess, in these internet ideologies to a limited extent. So I thought,
the recognition on Substack has got to
maybe the validation, something like that. I don't know. But like, I was kind of interested in this kind of concept of the ego, and I kind of prefaced that discussion by saying I don't really know really what it is. I'm not on the internet enough about it, but like there's some elements of it that seem quite self-evident to me, right? And the ego, I think, is very much a sort of like an attempt at kind of like mediation in the aftermath of this whole like Gamergate thing, I guess, right? And it's a strange sort of mediation because it's kind of this very weird chaste projection, and it's an approximation of like very kind of perennial sort of traditions within, I guess, literary history or philosophy, etc., right? And I think the trope I used was Abelard and Eloise and, like Sturm und Drag, German Romanticism and various sources, etc. I mean, that's basically my summary of those essays, yeah. People seem to like them, so I might write a few more of them.
The part of them that struck me the most was describing these relationships as consolational rather than anything to aspire to. Because in someone like Destiny, like you're not watching him because you admire him or interacting with him because you admire him. On one hand, it's a consolation that you can watch him and go, well, I'm not that at least. For all my flaws, I'm not Destiny. But you can also look at him and I guess see some of your flaws acted out, and in an interpassive way you can indulge in your own flaws without actually having to suffer any consequences for doing so, for behaving like a baboon in public.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And I guess that's to some extent a little bit constructive, I guess. It's not entirely negative. Well, people there is an element of Schadenfreude to it as well, I guess, right?
More than an element.
Yeah. But okay, I think the stronger element is definitely this kind of identification recognition thing, right? Okay, because I'm not immune to that either, right? So like during that period when I was writing Agonist, and even before that, like because I moved around a lot, I had a lot of friends in Scotland. I don't find it particularly difficult to make friends, IRL, etc., right? And I did, but I had some very good close friends who I love a great deal, and because I kind of moved around countries and etc., I'm always kind of like I don't see them very often at all, like maybe once a year of that, and then there'd been periods when I never saw them for a couple of years, etc. And I really liked the podcast Come Town, which
they got me through the
quite recently, right? And then I was trying to kind of like, and it's kind of like really pretty like cringe and stupid to intellectualize it because you don't really need to, but like what I got from that was a sort of vicarious thrill of hanging out with the boys, right? Hanging out with the lads and like bantering and stuff, and there is that kind of element also in this notion of the internet guy. You get to like hang out with the boys, whatever. But those guys aren't my friends, right? There's that parasocial element to, well, I don't know those fucking guys. Right? Like, I mean, to be fair, they seem pretty cool, right? And I'm sure they are cool, right? In real life, whatever. I'm sure they're cool to hang out with, whatever. But like, I'm not immune to that. Like, I used that essentially when I was living in Japan and it was the pandemic, like 3 years, and there was nobody coming in and nobody's visiting. I used that to a large extent as a sort of friend replacement. Right? So like it's when that level of recognition transmogrifies into a replacement for actual real corporeal experiences is when it becomes negative, right? Because you shouldn't use it as a replacement for real experiences, right?
Yeah. I feel like it becomes most damaging when it begins to serve as a form of replacement without any positive consequences. I mean, positive consequences in consequences that bring something new into your life. Because when you're hanging out with your corporeal friends, there's a permanence to that, in that your relationships, on the basis of you interacting with them, are going to change over time. They're going to see you slightly differently based on what you say, based on how you act. And you to them, there's that reciprocity. Whereas something like if your entire social experience just turns into listening to Cumtown episodes from 2019, you don't actually have that change anymore, or that consequence. And there's something quite infantilizing about that, in that you're now just living without any sort of durability. Sure, long term, it's going to be changing you, but it seems to me deeply infantilizing that consequence.
Everything about modern culture is infantilizing, right? It's difficult for me to really recognize what has caused it. It's obviously like a cumulative effect of various different things, but I think mostly the internet, right? Because you're able to kind of indulge the fantasy of like an extended adolescence and not be judged from like an organic community for like, ignoring your sort of duties to a social body and like any sense of organic solidarity, etc. Right? So, I mean, if I have like a stupid like fixation with like comic books or like Marvel, whatever, superhero films, it used to be that, like you'd grow out of it eventually, right? Like,
or you'd be forced
you'd be forced to some extent. Maybe you still hold on to your comics and your action figures, and then you could sell them on. But like you would get married, and you would have children, and you would kind of like recognize that life is composed of different stages, because you had these kind of like stages of life that were marked by these events, and that forced you to grow up, right? You were forced to grow up, but with the internet, you're forced to not grow up if you don't want to, right? You can just hang out with a bunch of other people online that have the same weird interests as you and also don't have a desire to grow up at all, right? So it's this negative feedback loop of reinforcing really sort of self-abnegating sort of behaviors, right? And that's what's infantilizing about it, I guess. Did I just disappear there?
No, you still
sorry.
here.
No, I just I clicked a different window by mistake. So I think that's what's kind of infantilizing about it, right?
There are multiple mechanisms for infantilization. It could also be on a background of a fairly inhuman environment. So an environment where we live in at least in cities, population densities which are just unprecedented. At basically any other time in human existence. Quite regimented lives, constant surveillance. So it could also just be a fear or a comfort response as well to regress into fairly childish forms of entertainment. There is also just capitalism is pretty libidinal. It's pretty good at supplying you with immediate, short-term dopaminergic gratification. And I think if you're blasted with that from early life, like that's going to have an effect, a fairly fundamental effect.
Yeah. I mean, the current generation of like young men grew up completely with the internet, right? And with like early access to like internet pornography and stuff, right? But like I grew up with like a dial-up connection from the age of like 12 years old, and like, you know, it was it was still kind of risque, mysterious element to the pornographic imagination. There's still a notion of like eroticism and titillation, etc. Right? But like that's being completely jettisoned. So you have to, by necessity, you're forced to have a different attitude to it, I guess, right? But I mean, yeah, I mean, it's addictive, right? It's extremely addictive, pornography.
Yeah, well, that's an element I wasn't even thinking of. But yes, it is. It's extremely addictive. And again, I think that lack of immediate consequence, I guess, is infantilizing, in that you don't have the consequence of having had sex with another human being and having to navigate the durability of that act, and the fact that it's an event that both of you will remember and will influence you from then on. Where there's something so spectral about porn. Like when you close your laptop, that one-sided relationship is completely finished and completely ephemeral.
Yeah.
That feels infantilizing as well.
It's infantilizing, but on a far more like insidious level. It's actually like maddening, right? Like the definition of Lacan's definition of like the kind of psychotic structure is an inability to distinguish between actuality and virtuality, right? So I don't think that's a distinction that many people could actually make.
I just don't think it's as clear a distinction anymore. As even when Lacan was theorizing that, I think the distinction is way more murky now.
Definitely, right? But but like, if there's a mental health crisis, then it's just people can't really tell which, like, there's no kind of like, the kind of like, I guess that the formation of a subjectivity was always a kind of perilous enterprise, right? But I mean, it's almost, it's by orders of magnitude more perilous when you have to navigate different types of like subjectivity, right? So you have your online, your kind of like internet, social media personality, which is completely at odds with like what you're like in real life. Like you meet people in real life and they're absolutely nothing like what they're projected to be on the internet. And I know that because I'm perhaps like whatever persona I kind of cultivate through like Instagram or whatever is not really what I'm like, right? In person. And that's why like people are so, I wrote about that recently on Substack actually, but like the Anthony Galuzzo wrote about his experience of like coming out of a very long-term relationship. He's like about the same age as me, I guess, and then having to do online dating and stuff, right? Like using apps and stuff, right? Yeah. And it just made me realize that way back in like 2013 when I tried like those apps, like not long after they came out. And, you know, periodically between then and before I met my wife, etc., I would go on those apps. And then there was always this weird kind of like dissonance because there was only one element of like, there's only one aesthetic element in the original sense of being related to perception that's like optimized within the app, right? It's this kind of idea of, it's also the most kind of like protein and changeable element, right? You could like cultivate a great deal of artifice in the way that your photos appear, right, on an app. Especially now, you could just like use AI and stuff, right? So I mean, there's that element, but that tells you maybe about like less than 20% of how attracted you are to someone when you meet them in real life, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, of course, people are not going to like be happy in being, like going on dates with people they meet on apps and stuff. Because I mean, it's all virtuality, right?
Well, it's particularly strange. I say this as someone who I just got so lucky and never dated through those apps. I feel truly lucky not to have done it. But from observing friends, it's an interesting thing because you get that the spectral nature of being online, of being able to present yourself in a I hesitate to say inauthentic way because I think even just inauthenticity becomes very blurry. But in a way that might not have as much correspondence to you corporeally as it could. But then it does hit the corporeal world if you meet with someone on a date, and you're now navigating them through the lens of having interacted with them virtually. And then adding on to that at least some promise of romance or sex to really charge things. I mean, no wonder people go insane using these things.
But there is that kind of element also, like, as I said before, there's also a kind of like really weird diabolical element to it, right? It's like, okay, on one level, it's like, oh, I wouldn't miss the connection of like, but you're kind of like tempting fate to some extent, right? Not to get kind of mystical about it, but it's like, were you meant to meet that person? Like, were you meant to like go on a date with them just because you saw it was like you used the fucking app made by some nerd, right? Right? I mean, didn't they invent the text message? The text message was invented. I don't know if this is an apocryphal like anecdote, right? But like apparently it was invented by Finnish computer engineers who were too scared to ask women out in person. So they invented like a text message that you could send to ask women. Like that was the purpose of it, right? But like this kind of like weird maladroitness is not universal, right? It's like something that was only restricted previously to a certain subset of people, right? Obviously, but now it's been universalized.
Yeah. Now that the technology exists, that latent, I wouldn't, maybe not antisocial, but just that latent social laziness of it's easier to.
No, but the same from the kind of idea of the ego, right? This projection. It's this fantasy of being able to remove risk from all kind of like experiences that kind of constitute life, like real living experience. The vitality of like existence comes within the negotiation with like risks, right? Especially if you're a man. Like, I mean, like you should be like risking something, right? But you don't really feel like you're risking anything when you're like swiping on these apps, etc., right? Because even if you like go on a date with these people and then you meet a woman, you go on a date, doesn't work out most of the time, and then you think, well, whatever. Or even before you even get to that stage, when you're just being like rejected by them and not matching with them, they're only kind of like real in a speculative sense, right? Just like a kind of like somebody you're interacting with and having an argument with online is just alive in the speculative sense.
Alive in the speculative sense, but it's real enough, I think, to harm you in some way. Like it still hurts when someone blasts you online, even though it's so it's
what was that?
So
who's that? Who's that rapper from like? Was that Odd Future guy? What was his name again?
Oh, there are so many Odd Future guys.
Tyler
the Creator is the most famous.
Tyler the Creator.
Yeah, the just log off
line. just walk away. How are you going to get cyberbullied? Just like log off. It's true, right? That's like one of the best explanations ever. It's just like I don't know.
Yeah, it is a bizarre world of attempting to remove consequence, and in doing so, and de-risking, but in doing so, you run a profound existential risk of turning into a complete failure to launch, of getting to a point, hitting 40 and realizing that your relationships have really been watching girls on Twitter smoke and pretend to read Hegel. So,
are there a lot of people like that?
I hope not, because then it's the performative aspect of the internet where is it funny? There's something maybe in the same way as that resentful consolation of watching internet guys. There's something strangely fascinating about watching people at least claim that their meaningful relationships with women are interacting with e-girls. I don't know to what extent they exist corporeally, or if they're just internet projections or not. So I don't know those sort of people in real life, but you certainly see them virtually.
They must exist. I think you're right. It's just really depressing to think about, I guess. Right?
It's incredibly depressing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really subscribe to this notion of privilege that much, but I do feel quite privileged to not be. I mean, I had my own sort of I'm just as addicted as anybody else to the internet, right? But I mean, as long as you have that kind of some sort of intellectual distance to it, way of sublimating it, I guess, writing essays or fiction about it is okay.
Honestly, I think the most powerful ways to resist it are just as corporeal as possible, or as biological as possible.
Yeah.
Even doing something like writing fiction, which it's something I like doing too, but even that it's sufficiently ghostly, sufficiently in your own mind that I just feel way more bleed over from the internet. Whereas something like fatherhood, and you wrote a really wonderful essay on fatherhood.
Right, yeah.
It's so intensely corporeal that it feels truly cleansing. I'm not overstating this. I think it feels cleansing to
100%.
interact with my child.
Yeah.
Against that dehumanizing aspect of the internet, because it's
definitely
real and corporeal in a way that even writing fiction or reading something on paper that's not trying to talk back to you isn't. Fully embracing the biological. I think
so, definitely.
Parenthood too works better than other corporeal pursuits, like, say, exercising, because even exercising can be, and often is, turned into a spectacle. It's not to say parenthood can't be either. I mean, you certainly find people who really seem to be trying to turn their children into content, but it feels more distasteful than videoing yourself exercising, and I think that sense of shame protects parenthood from dissolution on the internet in a salutary way.
No, you're right about that. I mean, I think it's the most important thing that I've ever done. I haven't really done it, right? But I'm doing it. But the most important thing that's ever happened is becoming a father, right? And I think I'm quite adamant, and my wife as well. Thankfully, that we're not gonna give him any sort of screens until he's much older, I guess. But it's almost inevitable at some point he's going to interact with him. He always sees us. And then also because my parents live elsewhere, and so do her parents, there's video chats and stuff, and whenever he sees me bring my phone out, he always associates that with his granny, and he says granny, or yeah, like, and then he's already making those kind of connections between. That's where granny lives in that device or something like that, right? But the kind of like difference I've seen about letting him just play with like normal toys and not showing him like any like stuff online, like this stuff also that's made to be extremely addictive, like all these things on YouTube and stuff, all these kind of like weird cartoons and everything. I think they're really visually like extremely like nauseating sometimes to me. Yeah, I don't know. I can't imagine that those children like watching it, but yeah, I don't know. That's just me personally. Maybe I'm wrong.
No, we're trying to limit screens as well. I find one very beneficial thing is that I have a greater sense of shame in interacting with the internet in front of my daughter. Like when I pull out my phone in front of her and she
I do as well.
is obviously very interested, I put it away and immediately feel ashamed. It's like, oh, I'm imposing my own bad habits on you, and you're not even a year old. And that's been really good for me, actually, introducing a bit more shame into my personal life. It's a very, very underrated aspect of human existence at the moment, I think.
I think so, man. I felt exactly the same, actually. Like, how old is your kid?
Dominodox.
Okay.
I don't want to say too much. Yeah, under a year.
Yeah. That's okay. Mine's is not that much older than a year at the moment. So it's quite recent for me as well. But no, I think I had like other family that did introduce their kid to like stuff on YouTube and stuff, and then I don't know, like it's difficult to judge the effect of it, but I feel like, I don't know, it seems to me there's that element of interpassivity as well, because like there's a very famous like YouTube show, and then they're all like, oh, I'll help with their like their like language skills and etc. But like if you're like watching someone speak, does that help you develop your own language? I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't think so. Like I have friends who are linguists who say no, definitely not. Like you need to like actually make mistakes and develop the way that you talk, and that you can see that in the way that my son is like developing speaking and stuff, right? Like he invents things, and then he kind of like builds on them, and he's doing really, really well with that, right? So like, I don't know. I think a lot of these things that are like, I guess, trends because like social media are like completely counterproductive. But I don't know. I'm not going to dictate to our people how they should raise their kids, I guess.
Yeah, well, I think this is of a piece with what we were saying earlier about that unidirectional communication, because with a child learning to speak from a screen, like the screen's not responding to them. Whereas if they say something to their parent, and it's ridiculous as things that children say tend to be, and you laugh, respond to them, and give them some meaningful feedback, some meaningful consequence in the world. That just feels categorically different. You're not even playing the same game.
It's completely different because I mean I guess they know what you say and what you do is like by orders of magnitude much more significant than what a stranger says or does, right? And that's obviously like a double-edged sword, as I've found recently. Like he's already coming because like I have a bad habit that I developed in the last year, like grinding my teeth like that. Maybe because of stress or something. And I noticed him
speed nonstop.
Definitely not, man. No, I'm completely sober at the moment. But I noticed that he's started doing that as well a little bit, like grinding his teeth a little bit. They just copy. They're like sponges. They just copy everything that you do, which is like really bad. Yeah.
It's that. It might be disorienting for me because I've grown up in an internet society, but
Yeah.
that slightly disorienting feeling of becoming the father, of becoming that figure of law upon whom a child is modeling themselves, and realizing that you're being imitated in a way that you've never been before, and you're no longer. And this comes back to that essay you have on your Substack, where particularly you're talking about Fathers and Sons by Turgenev.
Yeah.
Going from a figure of rebellion in some ways, of pushing against the authority of your parents, to being that figure of authority, of being the one who's actually setting out the structure of the world, which is disorienting. It was disquieting, but also extremely stabilizing, and something that I'm still slipping into. It probably will be for the rest of my life. I'm not sure if it's something that you truly come to accept fully.
Yeah, as I said, it's definitely the most significant thing that I ever done or accomplished or whatever. And that obviously goes without saying. But the weird thing in retrospect is everything I did seemed to be kind of like a preparation for it. And it's an extremely difficult thing to do, I guess, like, as you understand.
Yeah.
But what kind of made me, the kind of realization, almost epiphany I had in becoming a father and becoming a parent, is that you don't really, the way that you are is fundamentally changed, your role is, but your kind of basic impulses are still the same. Is that you're forced to kind of control them, right? Differently. And that's the notion of like stages of life, right? In a very kind of Jungian sense, I guess, that like if you have constraints and stages and things that marks those stages of life, then you have some chance at least of having a kind of fulfilling life, I guess. And the problem is not to stick around the problems kind of arise when you try to prolong certain stages too long, I guess. And that's obviously like a kind of a summary. It's not exactly accurate, but like, yeah, I don't know. And I don't know, as you're kind of aware, it's something I kind of recommend to whoever is able to do it. They should do it, right? It's the kind of fundamental purpose of existence. And it's not even like anything else that's second to it, right? It's like on a kind of like metaphysical level, and even on an empirical level, that's the purpose of existence, isn't it? So like, I mean, there could be any amount of sort of like rationalization and denial of that purpose for whatever kind of reason, cultural reasons, whatever. But like, there's no getting away from it, right? If you want to sort of, you should, if you're able to do it, then you should try and do it, right? And then through that, you would kind of come to some deeper understanding of what the purpose of life is, which nobody will actually figure out.
No. It's interesting that you brought up Jung, because it was actually, there's a particular essay by Jung on the stages of life. I think it's in Modern Man in Search of a Soul. It might be elsewhere as well. That in reading that, it did start the process of deciding to have children for me. Of that feeling he describes of stuckness, of the realization that I was, as do many of my peers, living as sort of a 20-year-old, even though I was approaching 30, and realizing that there truly are seasons in life, and I'm not sure if I'd say need to embrace them, but you need to accept them. And there is that feeling of being, of release when you do actually step into the stage of life that you really should be occupying. But I mean, like, and these things were really like structured very easily for previous generations, right? And like, there was always because we've been conditioned to kind of live life as sort of in the aftermath of like, the 60s, etc., the kind of valorization of a bad subject, the anti-authoritarian figure, the sort of like very kind of boomer notion of like,
if you rebel in a very kind of puerile way,
A very
and
adolescent way.
yeah, that's the kind of like the bad subject, as Althusser said, is the kind of like the is the kind of like standard subject, right? So like, I mean, counterculture is the kind of like default position. The internet was conceived as and still exists as a countercultural sort of phenomena, right? Right. I mean, you look back into sort of like the development of the internet in, I don't know, like Silicon Valley. The Californian ideology is very much a countercultural one, right? That still persists to this day. So there is the idea that you should always try to sort of go against convention. But, you know, I'm not saying that I'm some sort of like traditionalist or something, but like, I mean, the stages of life were already conveniently kind of like conceptualized by previous generations, right? And they provided a sort of like necessary constraint and limits to certain like impulses and behaviors, which, if not kept in check, lead to destruction and self-destruction and dissipation, right? So those aren't necessarily bad things in and of themselves, right? So, I mean, why not settle down, get married, have a kid, you know, like do that sort of thing? If it provides you the kind of necessary means. And I'm not just saying have kids as a kind of like selfish thing for your own actualization, definitely not. But I'm saying that, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, constraint stages of life, they're all good.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for actually constraining your desires. I mean, just being a pure desiring machine is not. It's just a fairly dysfunctional way to live. It's
extremely dysfunctional, yes. I mean, like this, I was looking at some of your notes and stuff, this idea of guilty pleasures, optimism, etc. And like this sort of absolving effect of like claiming sort of mental illness, etc., right? And not having to take any sort of responsibility for your actions, etc. Right? And then, you know, like, okay, the reason why Jordan Peterson was so like kind of like, I guess, popular is that he kind of reconfigured this kind of like very strange archetype of this Protestant stern father, despite himself being
he's an internet
exactly the kind of reflection of that kind of father figure in popular culture anyway, you know, like this kind of like and they got the kind of like weird experience of having this stern talking to about the dad, but then also witnessing the dad in this kind of like lowest moments, like Willie Loman, Death of a Salesman. Except being a sort of like hapless salesman. He's like a professor of psychology, right? Like, I thought it was kind of funny. But yeah, people they have that kind of desire for like discipline and rules and constraints, right? Mm-hmm. And I was kind of lucky because I grew up playing team sports, and I still do. After kind of time away from it, I was talking to another writer that I was having a conversation with, like on a podcast recently. We were talking about like how playing team sports, playing sports in general, gave you that kind of like insight into it, right? Like, and then team sports I think are particularly good because it really places you within a certain kind of hierarchy and introduces you to a sort of like objective environment in which you don't really have to take any recourse to any sort of false notions of humility and stuff, right? Mm-hmm. Which, if you kind of like existing in a purely artistic sphere, can exist, right? You know, you can say, oh, you know, I'm so glad that you read my writing. And I'm so like good for like grateful for etc. experience and all that kind of stuff or whatever, right? But you can't say that on a sports team. You can't say I'm glad for the experience of like, no, I want to go out there, I want to score some points and I want to win, right? But like you put everything on the field or on the court or wherever, like I play basketball, and then if you lose, you don't really give a shit. But like that's an experience that a lot of people are alienated from increasingly, I feel like, right? And like, yeah, I still like, I don't know. Part of what keeps me young is like, I still like go and like play pickup with like 17-year-olds on the court and stuff, right? Like, and like, the kind of like, it's really good for us as zone of like interacting with like, cause you go to like a public court, it's always like different ages and stuff, and they're all like mixing it up and stuff, right? So I kind of like interact with like Zoomers in that way and stuff, right? Like 17, 16-year-olds up to like 24, 25, whatever. And like, I still play like amateur league basketball here in Austria and stuff. And there's a few like younger kids and stuff. But like what I notice is the way that they play is extremely influenced by the internet as well, like basketball. Like they play like they're on like a YouTube like highlight reel. Like they don't pass the ball. Like they play like, I call it Zoomer ball. Like they play as if they're like watching a reel or something. How those guys are like dribbling around and like trying to like drive to the basket. Like they have no notion of like the fundamentals of basketball. Like, and whenever like we play like a full court pickup game, it'd be like me and a couple of guys around my age and we'll play against them. And like some of them will be like objectively really good players, but they'll get like absolutely thrashed because they don't pass the ball.
Is that strange
like
thing
that's
where
kind of significant somehow.
Where the camera lens is in your mind continuously,
Yeah,
or is observing
exactly.
yourself or imagining yourself as observed, which is a strangely discontinuous way to live. I can't say that I'm totally free of it too. I think we've all internalized this idea of being
100%
observed all the time. It just sounds like you've got enough mental muscle memory that you're able to function in a team.
Yeah,
without considering yourself to be the main character of whatever particular.
but yeah, these kids
watched.
like these kids like they naturalize this notion of like themselves as kind of like always some sort of like nodes of data or content or something, right? And like being constantly observed and sort of like, you know, the cliche of the panopticon or whatever.
The panopticon.
It's weird. That's just one observation I had. Sorry?
The panopticon I find I hear it a lot, but I just think it's such an imperfect cliche because entertainment is such a key aspect of this strange condition, which is it's absent from the Benthamite prison.
And I guess that was a utopian notion because like it was tied to the idea of an organic community, right? So like that kind of observation was much better because it was invested with like intent, I guess, right? Like people in a community will kind of spy on you to some extent and observe you or keep an eye on you because they have some interest in you and what the part you play in a kind of extended family of the community, right? Like I live in a fairly rural like village now, and you still get that, I guess, right? Even though the kind of like it's perhaps not as strong as it used to be, definitely not. But I mean, I walk around and I kind of like talk to my neighbors and that kind of stuff, right? However, that's a kind of notion of a sort of being surveilled and observed, right? However, on the internet, it's one that's kind of like done by a sort of anonymous, all-seeing big other, right? That has no interest in your personhood and your subjectivity and doesn't have your interests at heart as well. It simply wishes to kind of like exploit and monetize whatever it is that you provide willingly.
Yeah, well, the willingly is an important aspect because the panopticon, it seems like that being observed is not necessarily something you're seeking out. Like it's a fact of life that you tailor your behavior to accommodate yourself to. Whereas now a big difference seems to be that the performance is in part something you seek out. Like you're trying to be observed.
Yeah, I think so. Especially, I mean, yeah, because I mean, okay, the problem is you can't really exist as an artist, as a writer, without being your own publicist, I guess, promoting yourself. Because everybody, there's no kind of reading public or an artistic public. There's been a kind of like shift in towards everyone is a potential artist or a writer or a creator themselves, right? Or in training. They're only observing and doing something or participating in something so they could do it themselves. So that's the kind of big shift. And that there doesn't seem to be really anything that resembles a kind of spectator or an audience that's only those things, I guess. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it is a truly bizarre world or situation we find ourselves in. I mean, to an extent, maybe it always feels unusual in that by virtue of living at a particular moment, you don't know what the future is going to be. You don't know how it ends, which you can know when you look back on a time and it seems to make more sense. But it does feel like now is a particularly unusual time.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's, I don't know. Would you think it's like a cause for like pessimism, generally speaking, or I don't know?
It's probably just not. I can't say I'm blanketly pessimistic or optimistic about it. Yeah, I really don't know. All I can really say is from my personal perspective, my approach has been to try to be more embedded in almost an animal existence by meeting with people in real life, having children, focusing on a family,
100%.
focusing on is just not reading the news, trying to limit social media, focusing on reading books that are like dumb books that don't talk back in some way. Like I need to creatively misinterpret them to have them communicate with me.
Yeah.
Like beyond that, I mean, I really don't know how to make a sweeping statement about whether I'm pessimistic or optimistic. I guess in the sense that I'm trying to step back, that on some level demonstrates some pessimism about the project of increasing communication between strangers mediated by extremely addictive software platforms. But that was a very rambling answer, but I guess I can't.
No. I
don't know how.
No, you kind of touched on the point at the end there, right? Like, I mean, I'm fairly certain that like there is utopian potential for. It wasn't completely wrong that the notion of being more connected is the path to a sort of utopian existence, etc. Right? But utopia is like, I don't know. A lot of people are kind of like down on the notion of utopianism, I guess. But like, okay, a more sort of ideal or something, a more harmonious existence, I guess, right? And that's totally true. But you're not going to get to that with the sort of current economic logic that we have, right? Which by necessity completely sort of messes and destroys, I guess, any potential for kind of any sort of idea of a utopian existence, I guess. Because I mean, the technologies themselves, if they didn't have the underlying logic of profit and the various methods it uses to kind of gain profit, because they're essentially parasitic, right? Then it would definitely be a far more positive thing, a far more positive influence, right? Because I mean, I'm talking to you in Australia,
Yeah,
where you
yeah,
currently are. I think. I'm sorry, I'm not doxing you.
no, people. I'm fairly clearly
Well, they're
Australian. As soon
Australian.
as I open my mouth.
Sure. Like, but I mean, there's so many people that I've connected with all over the world because of the internet, right? Meaningful kind of like connections with people whom I haven't actually met in person yet, right? So I mean, but those were done on the basis of just basically communicating, right? And without any other sort of motive involved, etc. And those are very interesting kind of like encounters, etc. But like, if we remove and reform the internet, then there is potential for something positive, I guess.
Yeah, and you did bring up the part of the internet that I really like and I feel genuinely adds to my life is the correspondence aspect of
Yeah.
it. And
Yeah.
correspondence is important. Like the co prefix is doing a lot of work there. That it's actually communication between two people. And so say, you know, when I wrote to you on Substack, sure, I've never met you and I've only interacted with you through your writing. So there is a lot of intermediation there, but you're still identifiably a person rather than the screaming unconscious of Twitter. And so that correspondence aspect I get a lot out of.
This is why I've never really understood people's like. I don't know what point it happened because honestly, I was not like a regular like Twitter person. I was just like something that I saw incidentally. But like at some point, people just decided to all just become anonymous on it, right? Like I just never really understood that. I just like thought,
you know, voice your dissident opinions then.
Yeah, but like it's kind of like it just removes any sort of like notion of, I don't mean to sound like a prude, but like so like civility in the sense that what you say has to kind of come from, is a reflection on who you are. So you have to moderate what you say, and you have to kind of, because if you say something nasty that's unnecessarily mean and like, you know, not particularly nice in person, then people are going to think you're a cunt, right?
Yeah.
They're going to think you're a wanker. And then not many people, if you're like said some of those things that these anons say to like other people, are going to think, all right, okay. Like, even if you say it to someone that people dislike, you're going to come off as like rude and not very pleasant, right? That's not that's not a bad thing, man. At the very kind of like latest, if you just make yourself like, you know, whatever, if you just have a profile with your name and it's tied to it, then the things that you say, you have to really think about what you say, right? It's a far more interesting thing because it gives you some constraints to play with. So you have to be a bit more like thoughtful in what you say. You can still be kind of like dissident, but then you have to say it a bit more intelligently and not or whatever, you know?
In some ways, it's like the relationship between culture and counterculture. The tension between identified and anonymous spaces, in that I think there is an important role actually for anonymous spaces where you can go and just scream, say things you mightn't say in day-to-day life and just blow off steam. I think that's good for people.
Is that good though? This is because I mean there was something about that to Agonist.
You want it in the context. Yeah, I think you want it in the context of like 95% you are accountable for your actions, 5% you just want to exercise some demons. The problem is it's like the culture counterculture thing. I think counterculture is like, it's a good thing to have in society. The problem is when it becomes the dominant mode of cultural production, it gets really dysfunctional when it just starts eating itself, when it becomes the dominant culture and doesn't know how to deal 100%.
With it. So similarly, I mean, the weird thing is about, I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you. Continue.
Go for it.
No. I just please finish the point because I think I have something to add.
I was just going to say, similarly, with an anonymous, just venting of anything devoid of executive function, when that becomes the dominant mode of communication, you've got serious problems.
Yeah.
Which is kind of what's happened.
So, I mean, what I noticed about there's kind of like anons on the sort of like right and the left is that they're very similar in their kind of affect. That probably came across in Agonist as well, right? And like,
yeah.
They're both within that kind of countercultural register, right? Like, even,
and that adolescent countercultural register, because
yeah.
If the counterculture as maybe uncharitably, the way it currently exists, I feel like is kind of an arrested development. It's the failure to become what I would think of as an adult.
It's infantile. Yeah, for sure.
If that's dominant, then you've got a predominantly infantile culture. And Twitter anons, to me, feel infantile as well. Like they're chimpanzees throwing shit at each other. Or normally not even throwing shit at each other, because the flow of communication is also kind of interesting in that they tend to be vicariously throwing shit at each other because they rarely interact. They're like right-wing and left-wing anons. They tend to just talk to people similar to them about how much they hate other anons with whom they're not interacting. You've got this bizarre parallel circular communication going on.
Definitely. But like what you were saying earlier about like, okay, it gives you some sort of like some capacity to sort of vent and sort of attain catharsis or something, right? Like, but I did like dabble in like making like an anon account and posting something, nothing like particularly bad, but just like saying things I wouldn't usually say, or like slagging people off or something like that. But I didn't find it cathartic at all. If anything, it kind of like makes it kind of, you double down on the sort of poisonous feelings and stuff. I have a friend who's like I play basketball, right? But like my friend, there's a local rugby team. He's Irish, and he's trying to like get me to join the rugby team because he need like, like I'm relatively tall, and he's asked me to come to training. I was like, he's like, yeah, it's great because like I don't really have the build for it, but like irrespective, it doesn't matter. But like, he's saying like I get to like just like hit people.
Yeah, and you get to get your head hit.
I just get to like knock guys over and shit, right? And then it's totally allowed. And then after that, I feel like totally chill. Like he's like he's like a vegetarian. He's like into meditation and stuff. Like, I mean, I don't think that being an anon is cathartic at all. It just like reinforces, and you get to get away with like your kind of poisonous behavior and then reproduce it, right? Reinforce it somehow.
It might be getting back to that. Something we keep returning to is that it's almost that lack of physical consequence. If it's sufficiently ghostly, then you don't get that catharsis. So I don't play team sport, but I'll go to particularly metal and hardcore shows. We're in the mosh pit, especially with hardcore. It's like you're not
totally, man. I remember that.
You're not trying to hit people, but you know, you're kind of steering yourself towards them, and if they catch your elbow, then they do.
100%, man.
And totally. And you come out of it having like punched a bunch of strangers and gotten kicked in the head or hit by a stage diver, and you feel great.
Definitely.
Maybe it's the maybe you need that corporeality. Like you actually need physical pressure.
Definitely
to achieve proper catharsis. I also note we just keep bringing in psychoanalytic terms for the internet. Maybe that's the most fruitful way to view it.
Well, you brought another good point about like people going to the gym, because I mean I like lift weights as well, right? It's good for whatever, right? Like conditioning and like, you know, makes you feel good as well. But like I sometimes like when you just like lift and you don't do any like cardio, I feel like it's almost the same as kind of posting it. There's not that much sense of like catharsis or release and stuff, right? So like it's a very kind of like internet way of doing exercise to some extent, like going to the gym, because it provides
it's a highly technicized or mathematized way of doing it, in that it's very much so. Okay, you can make running very based on numbers too if you're just trying to get paces and distance goals, but the gym particularly lends itself to spreadsheeting everything.
Yeah, definitely.
Like, everything you're doing, you've got your sets and reps and the number of kilos you're doing. You can even go into, okay, how long am I spending between sets? How am I progressing over a set period of time? You can so this gets very Heideggerian. Like you can completely escape from being purely into the numbers of it, which is, it's possible with running. It's just harder because you're outside.
Yeah.
If you live near nature, running through the forest, you get into that nice state. I find also beyond a certain distance with running, you just achieve this quietness that makes it very hard to get caught up in the numbers.
Well, I never really got into running, but I recently got into approaching middle age, got into being a bike wanker, like riding a road bike. I got a Lycra and stuff, so that's kind of cool. I like doing that, and you get something similar. And you're outdoors, which is an important thing.
Yeah. Instead of being in a room just with your numbers.
Totally, definitely.
Yeah. So where to go from here? I feel like I read an essay you recommended by Althusser.
Oh yeah.
On aleatory materialism, the underground current of the materialism of the encounter.
Yeah.
I'd be very happy to talk about it with you. But it's been an hour and a half. Like if you're tired and you want to call it, I'm also happy to do that.
I can talk about it briefly. I think it's a very interesting essay. I grew up for some reason, I'm not entirely sure why. Perhaps because it was fairly tragic life, I guess. I was very drawn to Althusser, and from a very relatively young age, when I was an undergraduate, all the way through my graduate school, etc. And then I only kind of came to that later essay much later, and it's one that he wrote before he died, not too long before he died, after his kind of big crisis in which he involuntarily killed his wife, and was committed to a mental institution, etc. And it's the culmination of his work, and I'm not going to provide as good an example as a really good scholar like Warren Montag, for example, who's written a book on Althusser in which he kind of provides an exegesis of all of Althusser's work in context, and he's read all the archives, etc. Warren Montag's Althusser and His Contemporaries is a fantastic book. I would recommend highly. But I think that this essay on aleatory materialism is extremely interesting. It's because he basically... So the interesting thing about Althusser is that he started off, like many people on the European left, as a Catholic. He became a Marxist because he was a Catholic, right? And he said that several times. And to some extent, he never he was publicly a sort of atheist, but he used to visit a cloister of nuns that were not far from the Rue d'Ulm in secret quite often. He used to have discussions with them and stuff, and he was very good friends with a Catholic priest who used to have theological discussions with, etc. So in the underground current of the materialism of the encounter, it's basically this attempt to push the notion of materialism, which he says is a very shaky sort of notion. But if he is, and if we are, etc., in that mode, to be, a science of materialism as Marxism purports to be, etc., right? Then how do you push that to its very limit, right? Because what he says is that everything that purported to be materialism before was merely idealism in disguise, right? So what is the very outer limit of materialism? It is the kind of notion of the aleatory, right? There is no teleology, right? There's no telos to the notion of a materialism, of Marxist conception of existence, etc., right? Because there is no kind of stages to capitalism. It's not eventually going to end and usher in a utopia of socialism, communism, etc., because that's an idealist position, essentially, right? So he says that, well, the very basic notion of a materialism has to rest on the idea of the chance encounter, of the sort of like the notion of the atoms falling like rain parallel to each other, and one of them falls slightly at an angle and then causes some sort of chain reaction. But that didn't have to happen. It didn't have to happen. And it was likely that it wouldn't have happened at all. Everything that can be conceived as material and material existence exists because of chance. Okay? So what caused that chance in the first place? It's not enough to say that it is an unknown, that it's something that we're not able to know at all, right? And this brings us down to the very, this is a prescient essay, because it takes you all the way to the Large Hadron Collider and to CERN and to this notion of like the God particle, the Higgs boson, etc., right? And then even down to this kind of like the very kind of tiniest level that you could kind of get to, there is this notion of the aleatory of chance that still exists, right? So he basically attempts to kind of like demonstrate through the history of philosophy this notion of the aleatory materialist shadow discourse. And that's what it's really not. It's a really crazy essay, right? And it was only kind of like put together through his various notes and stuff by Althusserian scholars, etc., right? And it's a very difficult essay. It's a very mystical essay. Yeah, I recommend it.
It does several things that I really enjoy. So one, I'm a sucker for histories of ideas, and I particularly like it when the author says that I've uncovered what all of these thinkers actually meant. You know, I've worked out this through line between Epicurus, Machiavelli, Spinoza, Heidegger, Derrida, so on. Yeah. That they're all actually partaking of this tradition or hidden tradition of aleatory materialism.
So I mean, the interesting thing about Althusser is that he was like a philosopher's philosopher, right? Like he read everybody, and he was extremely well regarded in this,
and taught like extensively.
His grasp, taught extensively, and was like extremely highly rated in his kind of like habilitation, etc. Right? He taught a number of people who went on to become prominent philosophers in his own right.
Yeah, he had some crazy students, because wasn't it like Badiou and so on were
Jacques Rancière, Derrida, and Etienne Balibar, many others as well. Also, like complete frauds, like Bernard-Henri Lévy, like BHL. Bernard-Henri Lévy was taught by him as well.
Was he the television idiot as described?
Yeah, that's him. That's right. that's how Gilles Deleuze described him, I think. We should probably wrap up, right? I should probably make a move. It's fun.
Yeah, we'll wrap up whenever you want. I will keep going.
Sure. Yeah.
The one other thing I wanted to say about this particular essay was I'm still not quite sure how to read the rest of Althusser's body of work in light of it, or whether that even makes sense as a
Well,
project or not.
that's where Warren Montag's book is actually really good for that. Yeah, this is it here. So this book is extremely good, and I recommend it.
I'm actually.
I think he spent about 20 years writing it or something. Hold on, I'll turn this light off. So, Warren Montag.
Warren Montag. Yeah, there it is. I'll probably get that actually once we finish recording.
Yeah. So Warren Montag spent like this kind of thing is not probably happening anymore. But like, you know, Montag, very much a scholar of the old school. He's probably spent about 20 years writing that book. And it's not a particularly long book, right? It's like 200 pages or something. And it's just a very kind of like extremely in-depth discussion of Althusser, comparing his work and putting it in the context of the history of philosophy and history of like intellectual thought in the post-war, etc. And looking at some of the genealogies of his like work, where it comes from, the ideas, extremely like detailed, and it's really good for putting that essay in context.
Yeah, because from my limited experience of Althusser, I always thought of him as quite structural, quite cause and effect, quite rigid in some way, and then to come across this final essay that just blows that away was pretty cool.
Yeah, it does blow it away. It does blow it away. Like I mean, like these categories that are imposed on thinkers are very much like post hoc kind of like justification, right? Like I don't think that. I think Montag talks about this as well. I don't think Althusser ever thought of himself as a structuralist. He wouldn't really have understood that category at all. I don't think. Yeah.
So before finishing, I want to make sure listeners are also aware of Hyperidean Press. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly.
Yeah.
You're the editor of some really, really cool books from there, including Agonist. And the link to that will be in the show notes as well. Just wanted people to be aware of that project, because new presses that have an identifiable goal or style, that it's not just trying to appeal to as many people as possible, are really cool. They're kind of like those niche record labels where you buy stuff from them blind because you just trust the taste of the person who's signing bands. I get the same feeling with these sort of independent presses.
Yeah, that's a good feeling, man. I think that's a very like generous analog. I think that's the kind of thing we're trying to cultivate, I guess. That and that's what like a lot of the thing, you know, historically speaking, a lot of the presses that I kind of admired were like that as well, right? Because I mean, a lot of and especially this big five or whatever, they're all owned by the same like shadowy conglomerate, privately owned German family, etc. And they're not profitable, but they're very useful things to own, right? Because you own the means of cultural production, etc. But we operate on a kind of more archaic and old school sort of model, in the sense that we would like to have a cultural impact as opposed to sort of like commercial one. And then that just means the aim is basically just to get as many good readers as possible. And that's probably, it's far better to have like a handful of good readers than like just innumerable amount of people that just buy books as shibboleths or signifiers of something else. You know? Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to draw people's attention to that as well. So hour and 45 minutes deep. Because it's a cool project. Yeah, so wrapping up again, really encourage people to pick up a copy of Agonist. It's a really, really, it's a surprisingly fun book, actually, considering how how odd it is. People shouldn't be scared off by the fact that it is very unusual. It's very readable as well. There's much more humanity in it than people might think if they'd just heard it's these missives from the internet or from the void. There's definitely humanity in it, even if it's oblique at times. Are there any other projects of yours that you want to shout out before we wrap up?
Yeah. So the next book from Hyperidean Press is a book by the indie musician Saint Leonard, under his full name Kieran Saint Leonard, and it's called A Muse, and it's basically a kind of fictionalized memoir about his time, or a musician's time that resembles him, spent in the underworld of occult California, being led astray by the mysterious female chanteuse, which I think will appeal to a lot of people in its kind of like strange gothic charm and, that kind of milieu of around the early 2010s sort of indie music milieu, etc. Yeah. So check that out. That'll be out at the end of May. And you could pre-order it already. Maybe I could include a link for that.
Yeah. And people should also check out your the edition of Left Wings Over Europe that you've edited, all the volume, because I've seen more interest in Wyndham Lewis popping up. You might have timed things very, very well. I'm not sure if it was intentional or not.
Yeah, I've seen it, but it's kind of peaks and troughs, right? I've been into Lewis since like 2016. Well, a bit before that, actually. I've noticed there's a kind of like ebb and flow and interest in him. But hopefully this is already the second edition of the collected works that's coming out for OUP. So that's already a major kind of thing. So it might kind of like coincide with that. But it's really very much overdue because as my colleague and friend Andrei Kosuriak said, he really was like a one-man Frankfurt School, right? Like he was one of the most like significant intellectuals and artists of that particular period. And he wrote 40 odd books, right? Fiction and non-fiction. So like all of those are going to be published in these scholarly editions over the next 10 years or so, hopefully. Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, no worries.
Night on
Thanks for
Levi.
having me on.